Okay, but I'm here to introduce, first of all, apologies for the delay. I'm here to introduce our first speaker, Daniel Tutt. Daniel is a philosopher of Marxism and psychoanalysis. His writing and research concerns psychoanalysis, politics, and new directions in Marxist thought. He teaches philosophy at George Washington University and at the Washington, D.C. jail and at Marymount University. Daniel is host of the Emancipations Podcast, and he founded study groups on psychoanalysis and politics, which is an extra academic community that offers affordable seminars and study groups for students and the wider public. And these activities include seminars, conferences, and podcasts on texts and debates in the tradition of Freudian Marxism. Daniel is co-editor with Matthew Sharp of a forthcoming special issue of Historical Materialism on Lukács's The Destruction of Reason, and this should be published in 2024. His first book is entitled Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family. It offers an analysis of contemporary authority and the family and was published with the Palgrave Lacan Series. He also has a forthcoming book underway entitled How to Read Like a Parasite, What the Left Needs to Know About Nietzsche. And this book deals with the legacy of left Nietzschean thought and socialism. And it will be published in February 2024 by Repeater Books. So, Daniel's talk today is entitled Renewing Political Marxism, the Two Lefts and the Class Transitivity Problem. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. Does this work pretty well? Good. I'll try to talk loud so you guys can hear me. I think some people have traveled internationally, so in lieu of caffeine, I hope to give you about an hour and a half of somewhat exciting remarks, which really were inspired by what Nadia Ray, Natasha, Rami, and everyone, all of the organizers put together as the syllabi for this summer's BCAR Institute, which is just an incredible series of prompts and series of questions. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks especially to Nadia for the invitation, and to Rami for all of the wonderful logistical assistance. So, in his book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, A Theory of Political Organization, the philosopher Rodrigo Núñez identifies three primary reasons for the dissolution of the concept of revolution in Marxist, socialist, and leftist thought more generally. The first, Núñez says, is the collapse in a teleological, deterministic conception of history, which we can say also is the collapse of the mechanistic view of the stages of revolution, which was the sort of predominant theory of revolution from the Second International on through the Stalinist period. The second factor for the breakdown in the idea of revolution today is that within political movements and within Marxist thought, there is thought to be no transitive relation between social objectivity and political subjectivity. So this transitive theory of class has been abandoned in post-Marxist and contemporary leftist thought. Now, the transitivity problem here refers to a breakdown in a clear conception of the subject of revolution as tied to an agreed upon sociological understanding of the working class, which was the traditional, we could say, mechanistic view of revolution that we have inherited from the Marxist tradition from 1848 up through the dissolution of Stalinism. And nor is there agreement that another class would replace the working class, such as the lumpen proletariat or the peasantry today. Now, the third reason for the collapse of the idea of revolution is the more of an idealist reason, which has to do with the collapse in the very notion, in the very idea that a subjectivity, a collective subjectivity, would be capable of garnering something revolutionary that could be adopted and furthered. So there's also a breakdown in the very faith or in the very fidelity that we have at a mass level in the idea of revolution. So, in other words, the historically agreed upon social position and class relation of the revolutionary agents of Marxist thought, the proletariat as the revolutionary working class, which again can be characterized as a classical Marxist position, is no longer thought to possess a transitive relation to the social field, and thus the activation of the working class is sidestepped and no longer prioritized in Marxist thought, in fact. This is what I call the class transitivity problem. And now this is a problem that is, in some sense, actually, by many Marxist thinkers and by many leftist thinkers, seen as something which we should welcome. Why? Well, precisely because it enlarges the possibility of other subject positions to inhabit a possible definition of proletarian subjectivity. This is what Nunez actually welcomes, in fact. So the second reason that I put forward, Nunez basically champions as something that is to be welcomed, because he sees Proposition 1 and Proposition 2 as intimately linked, right? Which is that this mechanistic, teleological, determinist theory of revolution is something that also we now have the benefit of also abandoning, with the abandonment of the working class as the revolutionary agent. In a practical sense, therefore, the third factor, the decline in the very idea of revolution, has, in Nunez's view, caused the most problems for the left. So in his very excellent book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, he spends most of his time with this third factor of the very idea of revolution, because he sees the left as a sort of, as a split community which is tied together by an antagonistic relationship to some distant fidelity to revolution, albeit it's waning in our era. Now this loss of the revolutionary past has been given the name of leftist melancholia by thinkers from Enzo Traverso, Jody Dean, to Wendy Brown. And this leftist melancholia refers to a sort of pervasive ambivalence that exists within the culture of the left, globally speaking, not just a Western left. The left is thought to be racked with an affect of melancholia. This melancholic condition has the practical effect of decreasing the coherence of the left's own engagement with radical politics. This creates a situation in which the left acts almost blindly. So as to feel productive, important, and radical, the left acts, but its action is guided without a clear guidepost, a clear conception of revolution, as well as a clear conception of a revolutionary subject. As Jody Dean has argued, the melancholic syndrome leads to a death drive quality on the left, to a sense in which, from a psychoanalytic point of view, there is a paradoxical satisfaction that comes in the act of revolt, and the kind of fact that revolt produces effects, often which are not necessarily positive. They are failures that, in a way, oh wow, look at this. It's like an anime thing. What is that? Did you turn me into a GIF? What is this? That's amazing. I look like a cartoon. Oh my God. That is uncanny, speaking of psychoanalytic concepts. So anyways, now that I'm a cartoon, you can enter the metaverse with me. And no, but Jody Dean has a nice way of talking about this drive loop, where it's almost a kind of collapse of an idea leading to a sort of headless repetition. And this is a condition of melancholia, which of course in psychoanalytic sense is distinguished from mourning representing a position which would have abandoned or worked through adequately this failure of resurrecting the old revolutionary past. We're still caught in the in-between, in the interstices there. One of the effects of a kind of hyper-melancholic left is we place an oversized emphasis on the personal, on the local, on the small scale, and on single-issue campaigns. Another effect is that we have lost a collective vision of strategy. However, this turn to a kind of hyper-micro-politics that is detethered from a conception of revolution doesn't mean that the left is dead. It just means that the fulfillment that we get as subjects on the left is tied into this strange repetition of failure. Now, for his part, Nunez argues that we should welcome both the abandonment of this clear class transitivity commitment to the working class as the agent of revolution, as well as we should abandon, in his view, even the notion of revolution as such. In what follows, I want to, in a comradely way, of course, push against Nunez's position. I think that it's worth retaining a conception of revolution. And I think it's also important to note that the turn to micropolitics on the left is, of course, has a historical situatedness from the period of what's called the New Left, particularly the way that the Chinese Cultural Revolution influenced the Western left in the 1960s and 1970s. Some have argued that this tendency towards a kind of leftist melancholia and a kind of split or Janus face, what it produces is a kind of what I call the two lefts problem, is a historical tendency which actually can be traced back to the Second International. But I don't have the time to go into that interesting argument. But Nunez says there are some psychic effects within the culture of the left that this melancholic condition produces. It tends to lead to a sense of a logic that falls along the line of what's called an exclusive disjunction. We conceive of the left as either vertical or horizontal in its focus on political organization. The late Mark Fisher, in his turn to the acid communism project before he died, was obsessed with this internal two-left schism, what he called, on the one hand, the tendency towards a Leninist asceticism with a commitment to the new left, cultural, joyful, care-based left, right? You could date these tendencies as the 68 left versus the 1917 left, if you wish. But however you conceive of it, I think it's helpful to actually show that its logic falls into what Gregory Batson, the cybernetic theorist, calls schismogenesis, which is an almost irrational double bind. And this irrational double bind leads to a certain paralysis, even of communication within the left often. Now, the core project of Freudian Marxism, as I see it, actually in its inception, in Frankfurt School and onward, in a sense is trying to address this precise problematic. In other words, psychoanalysis should be seen as making a symptomatic critique of subjectivity, but I think also there's many psychoanalytic insights that go specifically to this cultural schismogenesis division on the left that I want to tease out. Because what the melancholic position leads to, in Nunez's view, and I agree with him here, is basically a schism over the unsatisfied desire that drives the left in this kind of headless, lacking both a clear conception of revolutionary subject and lacking a clear commitment even to the notion or to the idea of revolution. This leads to a sense in which within institutions of the left, as well as institutions of bourgeois institutions, NGOs, universities, etc., I think we are increasingly finding more and more these internal rivalries that appear. And I want to argue that, in a sense, psychoanalysis has a lot to teach leftists as militants, as a sort of practical manual for how to deal with some of these sense of rivalries. Of course, the rivalrous culture of the left, which I'm speaking now for an American left, which is after the collapse of the Bernie Sanders coalition, is more and more putting its trust in a kind of unorganized and spontaneous and nascent social movement activism, right? And seeking to find some hope in this kind of blind immediacy of an uprising such as Black Lives Matter that would then cohere something. But we have no conception before that, right? Therefore, we have an organizational deficit. And Nunez, for his part, argues that the way to cure us of leftist melancholia is to get much more serious on the question of political organization, for which I think he's absolutely correct. He's correct that political organization is a means for escaping this rivalry and the circuit of melancholic drive that leads to, frankly, the sad affects of a melancholia position. But I would argue that without a theory of class transitivity that can qualify the way that bourgeois institutions exert class power and sustain class status quo relations of domination, political organization risks perpetuating the same micro-political drive circuit. I thus want to argue that psychoanalysis offers a means to restore the abandonment of class transitivity in its own understanding of groups. I'm going to draw from the work of an Argentinian Freudian Marxist philosopher named Leon Rosicner, whose recently translated work, Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism, I find to be of paramount significance. But let me pull up my slide by first introducing, if this works, Remy, could you go to the next one? Thank you. Wilfred Bion's thought. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Wilfred Bion. I think that Bion is a thinker for whom this condition of leftist melancholia offers a lot of insights. In his text, Experiences in Groups, and in other texts, Bion puts forward three structures that groups adhere to. And they're outlined here, and there's a fourth, which I'll mention in a moment. And I want to share with you a bit of what this of what Bion's insights offer to us. The primary thesis of Bion is that the coherence of any group belonging is owed to a collective sense of fleeing an imagined sense of persecution that remains consistent across all three structures. The first, the dependent group, operates on the basis of accepting leadership on the structure of the Oedipal-parental relation. Each group member tries to claim the leader for his or her own. The dependent group is thus plagued with rivalries around an unacknowledged leader. Second type of group, the fight or flight group, relies on a dependency structure that is violent and exclusive. In this arrangement, there's a continual flight internal to the group over the question of the leader, as well as over the question of the truth that sustains the group as such. In this arrangement, the group ends up adopting basically a sadomasochistic structure. Now, the third sort of group is what he calls the pairing group, wherein the leader functions as the not yet born child. This group forms out of a desire for sex between two exclusive partners, and it tends to fortify itself off from new ideas and struggles to assign leaders who might steer the group in any new direction. Taken together, Bion's three groups share a common tendency, which is that the logic of their coherence, again, is the alleviation of a fleeing from a sense of persecution. Right? So when we associate in any group, Bion says that this is the unconscious structure that motivates us at a subjective level. Now, if you go to the next slide, please, Remy, in his analysis of alternative group structures that transcend this inbuilt rivalry, see, because even though the left has a melancholic condition which exacerbates rivalry, I don't want to say or have you think that this is somehow unique to the left. For Bion, this is the structure of any group affiliation, right? However, Bion says that in his analysis of Freud's group psychology and analysis of the ego, he puts forward this idea of what he calls the mystic group. The mystic group, which, as a side note, I don't know if you're aware of it, but Wilfred Bion was actually an advisor during the Second World War to assist the cadres of army units in overcoming their own rivalries, right? And sort of forming a certain solidarity. So it's a kind of military attaché advisor. And Lacan once gave a talk after the war concluded in classical Lacanian bombastic attitude, said Wilfred Bion helped the British win the war because he developed a structure of group cohesion which was capable of exceeding this internal rivalrous structure. Now, the way in which you exceed this rivalry structure is by shifting the external neurotic object that the group had assigned interior to the group. Right? In this sense, Bion offers a kind of, if like I said, sort of a practical manual for organizers on the left to refer to. So he's not necessarily offering a kind of meta-theoretical or class structural critique, right? Which Rosichner does. I will get to him in a moment. But it is this more practical, which I think his work is especially useful for activists and organizers, by the way. So while the mystic group offers a compelling solution for thinking local group harmony, much of its insights, I believe, remain difficult to generalize to more collective or theoretical levels, added to which this core notion that the conception of the enemy other that faces the group is reducible to the group's own neurosis is difficult to square with any class struggle-based political organization, which requires class enemies to be identified and worked with. Next slide, please. Okay. This is my next section, post-Marxism and the abandonment of class and exploitation. I'm going to make a return back to this class transitivity thesis here. An important task in addressing the rivalrous and often recriminatory internal culture that the left faces is to be examined and worked through also in the domain of theory. Right? It's not just a kind of practical or empirical or sort of group psychological question. It's also a theoretical problem. Now, to tackle the class transitivity problem calls for a new conception of political Marxism. And by political Marxism, I mean here a form of Marxism that emphasizes the subjective and the liberating dimension of Marxist practice, what Ernst Bloch called the factors that compel and lead Marxism to be identified with as a cause, right, for social and political emancipation. While this concept will hopefully become clear as we proceed, I think Ernst Bloch's idea of the warm stream of Marxism, or that form of Marxism that is concerned with how appeals of emancipation are forged in struggles, is close to what I mean by political Marxism, just so we're clear. I don't mean political Marxism as Brenner means it vis-a-vis economic theory, by the way. I mean it more in this practical sense. Now, as a proviso to what I'm about to say, the three philosophers I'm going to consider, I have immense respect for, and I am nowhere even close to their stature. But I am going to offer a critique regarding the effect of their theory on practical struggle. The three philosophers being Ernesto Laclau, Alain Badiou, and Antonio Negri. I'm influenced here, both in my political conception of Marxism, as well as in my remarks on these three philosophers, by two Marxist thinkers. The first is Ellen Mason Wood, who wrote a very important late 1990s work called The Abandonment of Class, A New True Socialism, as well as Isabelle Garot, the French communist philosopher who recently published a work called Communism and Strategy, which has recently been translated. And if you haven't read it, I think you must. Okay. Some of these comments will be reflective of some of her argumentation as well. Okay. The problem that arises when a theory of class transitivity is abandoned on the left is that we have a fundamental confusion emerge over how we mediate our activity with bourgeois institutions. we end up blurring liberal, socialist, and leftist in a kind of miasma. Now, in a sense, the three philosophers I'm going to make remarks on, Garo, and I agree with her fully, have in fact practically, at least in effect, at least in the way that their thought tends to be taken up by the left, have done this very problem. Now, let's go back to Laclau and Mouffe's Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, published in 1988, right at the kind of peak of the kind of TINA. Who knows what TINA stands for? There is no alternative, coined by Margaret Thatcher. Right when TINA became all-enveloping, we have this very ambitious post-Marxist. And keep in mind, when Laclau and Mouffe wrote Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, they were happy to be called post-Marxists, right? They were fine with that label in some sense. Inspired by Althusser and the distinctive melange of French theory of the 60s and 70s, what is most notable about this work is that they argued for an understanding of class and subjectivity that is no longer tied to relations of exploitation vis-a-vis labor, but predominantly tied to discourse and language. Woods, for her part, argues that the most damaging thesis that Laclau and Mouffe proposed was that there is nothing in the logic of capitalism which determines the development of a united working class. It follows from this contention that there is no such thing as a working class interest apart from and prior to its ideological construction. For Wood, this post-Marxist theory had regressed and returned to what Marx and Engels called true socialism in the Communist Manifesto. And the true socialists were the kind of revolutionary intelligentsia elite, such as Bruno Bauer and Moses Hess, who developed an abstract philosophical conception of revolution and socialism, completely detethered from working class interests. This is Marx and Engels in 1848. Wood in 1990s is saying that Marxism had regressed to this, which is a classic Marxist polemic to say everyone else is wrong, but I'm just kidding. But a central claim of Laclau and Mouffe in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy is that the failure of communism implies also that the very idea of socialism is also become discredited. Everything in Marxist theory was thus made eligible to be taken back to the drawing board and assessed anew. Now, to get at the radicality of Laclau and Mouffe's revisions to Marxism, we have to situate it in 1977 in Laclau's own Politics and Ideology in Marxist Theory. In this work, he begins to move away from what he saw as a fundamentally class reductionist worldview in Marx's own thought, and in the subsequent Marxism of the workers' movement. Equipped with the epistemological insights from French philosophy and with close attention to Lacanian psychoanalytic concepts, Laclau sought to make Marxism into a theory which, like any other theory, must be made subject to the exigency of a constructed coherence rather than a verifiable knowledge. In his view, Marxist ideas are clarified by their own internal and formal rules of construction. And this has the practical effect that ideology no longer needs to relate to class interests or to objective social interests. In this 1977 work, Laclau rejected the assertion that there is a basic antagonism between capital and labor, and he rejected the notion that capitalism can be construed as a mode of production. By positing that there is no basic antagonism between capital and labor, Laclau then proposed an account of contemporary society as in a state of continuous social disequilibrium. As is well known, over the course of his writings, Laclau eventually adopts a populist conception of politics, grounded largely in the ideas of Carl Schmitt, that politics is neutralized by the social sphere and thus the social power of rhetoric and discourse become the central preoccupation of leftist politics. However, I think the problem that emerges in Laclau's conception of populism and of leftist strategy more generally emerges in the ways that he theorizes class transitivity and how this affects the very category of revolution as such. By abandoning account of class as understood in relations of domination and exploitation, it ultimately becomes unclear what is to come in the wake of a rhetorical advancement of a hegemonic diverse bloc of leftist coalition. This leaves us with a hyperpolitics, cut off from the reality of exploitation, social injustice, and all forms of domination. And more precisely, Laclau maintains in his later work that capitalism is fundamentally untranscendable. Another important figure of contemporary Marxist thought is the French philosopher Alain Badiou. While there are profound differences in strategy and analysis between Ernesto Laclau and Alain Badiou, for example, Badiou refuses participation in elections, in labor unions, and all other capitalist parliamentary institutions, incrustations of what he calls capitalo-parliamentarianism. I want to argue that perhaps paradoxically, both thinkers, Laclau and Badiou, end up in a similar cul-de-sac regarding their praxis of political action. Badiou, for his part, proposes a radically revamped 21st century conception of Marxism, one in which communist militants are meant to subtract their activity from the machinery of capitalist-dominated political institutions. A position that is inspired, in fact, by Mao's critique of bureaucracy in many ways, even though that's not always clear. I think it's important to note that. Badiou's political thought, we can say, is a kind of double-edged sword for contemporary Marxism. He makes incredible contributions to communism in the areas of party, state, strategy. I would argue, again influenced by Garo, that there is a kind of practical effect of his thought that has the downside that it remains practically so disconnected from the world of institutions that we lack any theory of proper mediation with bourgeois institutions. Badiou insists on a separation of politics from social issues and from bourgeois institutions. This separation makes his very definition of communism ultimately risk becoming depoliticized. In Badiou's work, issues of social alienation, social relations of sex, and even race are largely absent. And I think this separation results in a paradox in which his thought ends up linking the existing liberal tradition to Maoism. But instead of actively contesting liberal hegemony within existing institutions and thinking their relation in a mediated fashion, as I think Marx does, Badiou's subtractive approach has the unintentional complicity with liberal forms of power, precisely by refusing to contest those forms of power within institutions. So it is this failure to mediate communist radicalism with existing political institutions that stands out as problematic. Of course, this is hard for me to say because Badiou's a philosopher who basically changed my life philosophically. But again, I'm talking about the practical effect of his thought. Sorry for all of the craziness going on there. I think Rami left. Okay. Thank you. Thus, even though Badiou differs profoundly with Laclau in his refusal to engage with capitalist and parliamentary institutions, the two thinkers' political analyses. Is that better? You were straining before. I'm so sorry. I'll use this as an opportunity to have some water. It's such an honor to be here. Who's traveled very far to be here? Look at that, half the room, like a third maybe, wow. Okay. So, what I'm trying to argue is that both Laclau and Badiou, in their abandonment of thinking a theory of subjectivity as related to this class transitivity proximity, to what? Well, precisely to issues of labor, exploitation, and domination. This has the practical effect of redefining their politics as local and experimental. And this is something that Badiou has in his organization, his political organization. He says, and I'll get to this later in my talk as well, this is the task of communist politics today, to be unabashedly local and experimental, small, etc. So with Badiou, you have this strange coalescence of a fidelity to the high ideal, part 3 in Nunez's 3 points of revolution. Garo says that Badiou, in a sense, is the philosopher of part 3. He is the philosopher that keeps at least our desire tethered to the idea of communism, right? In an age which has witnessed the collapse of mass parties, the collapse of socialist parties, etc. So he solves 3, but he doesn't solve 1 and 2. So we can say that Laclau and Badiou coalesce in their recasting of the modern proletariat away from the working class as the revolutionary agent of socialist struggle. For Badiou's part, it's both a combination of a theory of labor aristocracy as well as a kind of distant fidelity to Maoism that leads him to theorize the Western class, the working class within the Western countries as already pacified and already integrated into the capitalist system, right? So this is sort of one of the reasons why in the Yellow Vest movement occurred, Badiou was opposed to it. So with Laclau, it's different because the working class is decentered due to a built-in error of Marxist praxis going back to Marx himself. Right? So for theoretical reasons, they have participated in this abandonment. Now, the third thinker I want to consider here is Negri. In Negri and Hart's Empire series, I think we see perhaps an even more ambitious response to the class transitivity problem. Just as Badiou and Laclau's work, importantly, Hart and Negri's work has undoubtedly contributed to a revitalized idea of radical politics, having shaped the tactics and even the worldview of the alter-globalization movement of the early 2000s. However, I think theoretically, the practical effect of the retheorization of proletariat vis-a-vis the multitude theory is based on some dubious and contradictory theoretical positions. Inspired by Foucault's idea of biopolitics, which maintains that politics and production have fused, such that capitalism no longer organizes production, Hart and Negri argue that contemporary capitalism is no longer structured on a vertical relation with a figure of authority based in the classical contractual relation. The older nation-state forms of sovereignty have collapsed. This has given way to a decentralized and deterritorialized capitalism, in which here they redefine Marx's proletariat as the multitude. Now, the multitude is thought in a highly ambitious way, and this is something perhaps to their credit, and which incidentally is theoretically owed to Negri's own commitment to the autonomous tradition in Italy, the workerist movement, which Italian apparismo put forward a very interesting thesis that it is the working class that is the motor and the engine of all advances in capitalist society. But since they submit to this class transitivity crisis, they swap in this new class, this new cognitive proletarian, largely service industry oriented proletarian subject, but they infuse it with the same optimism as we had in Italian apparismo, which is a very interesting juxtaposition if you think about it. The multitude is thought as detethered from relations of exploitation and productive labor. Negri and Hart thus align with Laclau and Badiou albeit from completely distinct theoretical points of influence, in eschewing the idea of the proletariat as bound up in relations of exploitation or in relations of productive labor. The crux of Hart and Negri's argument is that immaterial labor, cognitive labor and service labor primarily, has become generalized in contemporary capitalism, and that this has given way to a liberatory potential in which cooperative relations are to be nurtured from within the biopolitical horizon of capitalist relations. Now, in a careful study of the third part of the Empire series called Commonwealth, Garrow puts forward a very convincing argument that one of the biggest shortcomings of the multitude theory has been ultimately that it paradoxically has resulted in a technocratic conception of the proletariat and of proletarian activity, right? Because Hart and Negri do not seek a break with capitalism, just as Laclau, they rather seek to embrace, quote, the tendencies at work rather than fighting them in vain. This is the accelerationist impulse of their work. This results in a theory of revolution in which the revolution, in a sense, has already occurred for them. So taken together, my comments on these three thinkers, I think we're witnessing a moment of the waning of this sort of failure to center a working class conception of the proletariat, especially after we see the rise of the worker demonstrations and protests in France against Macron's insane pension retirement policies, the Yellow Vest movement, the public service unionization movement across the United States, and other worker-based militancy. We see a kind of mismatch, a sort of two ships passing in the night, whereby post-Marxist theory is now encountering struggles in which worker agitation is once again at the very center of these struggles. But it has developed a repertoire of thought which has decentered the class question. So how do we reconcile this is a very important thing, because if we don't reconcile it, one of the consequences would be the continuation of a hyperpolitics cut off from the real of exploitation, social injustice, and forms of domination. Again, I'm not going to solve this tonight, but I think in order to do so, we would have to revitalize some conception of political Marxism that is attendant to institutional mediation, to the development of political strategy, that has developed a clear conception of the class transitivity question at its very center, and redefine the relationship between political and cultural revolution, a distinction that I think we often do not talk about enough, but which I will conclude on in this talk. So can you go to the next slide? Let me see if this works. Thank you very much. Now, I want to now turn to a theory of class that I think psychoanalysis uniquely offers, but perhaps in a way that you hadn't thought about before. So if the post-Marxist abandonment of a transitive account of revolutionary subjectivity is to be dealt with, one thing that's clear is that it cannot be dealt with purely through some economic, sociological, or even anthropological theory of class. Of course, we need that, but that cannot be the kind of sole ground by which we think the class problem, the class question. Therefore, I want to propose that psychoanalysis offers, the Freudian Marxist tradition offers unique insights into the question of the class transitivity problem. But I'm not going to approach this vis-a-vis Marcuse. I'm not going to approach this vis-a-vis Althusser and his legacy. But I'd like to turn to the Argentinian Freudian Marxist, Leon Rosichner, in his work, Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism. which I mentioned before, this is a systematic 500-page analysis of the entirety of Freud's social and political writings. Civilization is Discontents, Group Psychology Analysis of the Ego, Moses and Monotheism, etc. What I find novel in Rosichner's work is that I believe that he reveals a theory of the way that bourgeois institutions shelter and dominate our subjectivity by calling forth unconscious dependencies. Remy, can you do the next slide, please? Freud articulates a theory of a revolutionary group as an exit or a break from bourgeois forms of class dependence, as found in what Freud calls the artificial groups, namely the church, the army, the corporation, the NGO, etc. So it is this distinction, Freud makes three group distinctions: artificial group, spontaneous mass, and revolutionary group, right? More on that in a moment. The revolutionary group is distinguished, importantly, from the artificial group by an absence of the same obstacle that bourgeois institutions or artificial groups rely on, namely the obstacle between desire and satisfaction. The revolutionary group both reveals and seeks to overcome this opposition. The social bond of the artificial group is therefore formed around the necessity to preserve the present situation. As such, the object of the social bond of artificial groups is the integration of individuals. But the way that this integration occurs is through an aggressive affect, an aggressive identification. Quote, all individual conduct in bourgeois social life inscribes itself within a structure in which this aggressiveness appears as determined from within the ego itself by the system of production. But the logic of the dependence is ingenious within artificial groups because it's one of a concealment of that aggressiveness as tied back into the system of production. The revolutionary group functions to pry open and to make visible this complicity, which the bourgeois group conceals. Can you go to the next slide, please? We'll get to that in a moment. The social bond of the artificial group is formed around the necessity to preserve the present situation in a way similar to Bion's theory of the group bond. The artificial groups, the church, the army, the state, corporation, etc., form a bond around a common sense of persecution that each member faces. And in a sense, we should note that Rosichner was a Che Guevarist who witnessed the state capitalist experience of Peronism, went into exile, and was a sort of trained at the Sorbonne by Merleau-Ponty, very, very familiar with Lacan himself. Who's heard of Rosichner, by the way? Nobody in this room has heard of Rosichner. You see, this is good. Wow. Okay. I did a great podcast with Bruno Bostiels on my podcast about Rosichner, by the way. Because in a sense, you have to understand that even when Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus put forward their own theory of a revolutionary groupsicle, they are inspired by Jean-Paul Sartre's notion of the fused group from Critique of Dialectical Reason. And here, the structure is very, very much akin to Freud's theory of the revolutionary group, whereby the revolutionary group basically forges a kind of outlaw break from the artificial group. And the question becomes, can the revolutionary group sustain the fidelity to the law that they have broken long enough to sustain and to mature? Right? This is the kind of Sartrean and then later Badiouian question. Why does Badiou put such a big onus on fidelity? It really is tied back to this Sartrean notion of the fused group, which he's analyzing from the Jacobin position of the French Revolution all the way up past Marx. The revolutionary group for Rosichner forms a fraternal bond amongst its members. This bond is capable of locating and overcoming the repression that has been ignored at the foundation of subjectivity within the artificial groups. In this way, the revolutionary group emerges from the artificial group and therefore can only be thought in a mediation with artificial groups. In their activity of seeking a break from the contradictory reality of, can you go to the next slide for me? One more, this one. We'll talk about this in a moment. In their activity of seeking a break from the contradictory reality of the bourgeois groups, revolutionary groups generate a new knowledge in the act of their rebellion. A knowledge of what? A knowledge that it is the system of production that produces the cause of the lack of satisfaction of the members of the artificial groups. Rosichner, in a way similar to Lukács, talks about this being an objective truth. Talk about this being a new ideal, a new rationality, a new theory of revolutionary knowledge, if you will. A new ideal that promises, quote, a non-contradictory, non-dependent, and non-humiliated form of social being. But I think it's such a beautiful quote. The revolutionary group produces a new ideal that promises a non-contradictory, non-dependent, and non-humiliated form of social being for its members. Now, in figure 2, we could spend a lot of time on this. We have here something similar to Althusser's ISA, of course, on the left, of the repressive family at the very center. But one thing that's very interesting about Rosichner's conception of the family is that he's not a kind of anti-familialist, a la Deleuze and Guattari. He says that the task of the revolutionary group is to bring an awareness to the repressive bourgeois fathers of their own complicity with the kind of sham of bourgeois social life, to bring them into the new fold, right? Not to sort of surreptitiously, I don't know, abolish them, or those. Again, he's a thinker, a great thinker of mediation. Rosichner is. Why 3? We have 3 levels there. The center part is actually taken from Freud in group psychology, but the left and the far right, Christ in general, I thought would be interesting for you to think about, especially in social contexts in which you have elevated police states, repressive police states, militarized situation, etc. He's dealing with Peronism largely. Why Christ in general is there. So clearly there is a kind of contrast that to be teased out from this state capitalist scenario that he's looking at compared to, say, late mass consumer capitalism. But nonetheless, I think this is a very helpful model. For Rosichner, can you go to the next slide, please? There is a theory of leadership within the revolutionary group that I want to draw your attention to. Rosichner says that revolutionary groups possess leaders, and they have a particular function. The particular function of a leader is to expose, with the maximum actuality as possible, the repression of the bourgeois group. Thus, we can say the possible success of any revolutionary leader is defined by the extent to which they open and reveal the unsatisfied desire that bourgeois groups produce. The leader's function is continuously to fill this void with a new common reality, with a new common sense. The leader aims to confer on this new reality a common yearning amongst the people. In his reading of the concept of the superego, Rosichner argues that Freud's notion of the archaic father of the horde is located within the system of production. The primal father is locatable and therefore immanent. It's not some kind of mythic thing. And in this sense, there's a kind of psychoanalytic advantage that proletarian subjects have within capitalism for locating and possibly transcending patriarchal relations because of their proximity. And he builds a beautiful conception of what he calls a socialized superego, which is different than the logic of what dominates the bourgeois family. What does leadership look like within bourgeois groups, within the artificial groups? Rosicner says, first of all, there are no leaders in bourgeois groups. There's only directors. Why? Why would that be? Well, it's precisely because the function of a bourgeois group is preservation of status quo. So what is there to build that's new? There's nothing that necessarily needs to be created. So there's a kind of theory of bourgeois groups of non-inventive, non-creative, in some sense. And the function of a director within a bourgeois group is to play a substitute for the position of the father. Thus, bourgeois groups are defined by tethering each of its subjects to a condition of narcissism, to a condition of infantile dependency. The function of this infantile dependency is to make class struggle non-cognizable, not possible, to mute class struggle. The position of the father in the bourgeois family is based on an imaginary totality that does not include the conditions of social reality that produced him as transcendent and omnipotent. So even the father, the bourgeois father, is deprived of his own monstrosity, but his own monstrosity is based on an imagined monstrosity. So you see, the point would be that the revolutionary, in its own creation of a new ideal from this situation, would play the role of an exposure, which would then theoretically compel the father to exit this monstrous patriarchal structure. Bourgeois norms are shaped by the system of production, and the system of production serves as a bridge from the personal to the social being. They foster a subjectivity that must be, and this is, I think, very important, must be dependent. And this dependency leads to the invariable permanence of the system as such. So you see, the problem with bourgeois groups is a problem of dependency. It's a problem of dependency. A problem of dependency which seeks to conceal the true social origins and its complicity with the system of production. Now, that's a taste of Rosicner. There's much more that could be said about Rosicner. Could you go to the next slide, please? Yes. But as I mentioned earlier, I think a defining mark of post-Marxist theory has been a breakdown in this transitive conception, right? This notion that we have a kind of verifiable theory of class that already exists sociologically, for which, of course, a huge debate within the ultra-left, Gilles Dauvé, theory communiste, endnotes, etc., is whether the traditional revolutionary working class from the 1840s up through World War I was a political invention of socialist leaders, right, of unions, right, or whether they spontaneously emerged out of the conditions of immiseration of working life. Right? It's a question of leadership. Do you see why? It's a question both of a kind of, well, for Lenin, it's a question of imputed consciousness, which we'll get to in a moment. But one of the things I want to point out here before we get to that is pay attention to the implications of the theory of revolutionary leadership from, say, Laclau in his model to Rosicner's. What is Laclau's theory of leadership, if we could call it that? Well, the revolutionary leader in Laclau's framework has the task of coordinating heterogeneous social demands from a wide range of seemingly leftist movements, anti-racist, ecological, feminist, anti-capitalist, etc., right? If you like, the Laclauian leader is a kind of composer, composes and coheres these blocks. And I think that the Laclauian leader has been extremely essential for defining what leftist leadership has looked like from 2008 to the present. However, with the collapse of Syriza, Corbyn, Sanders, and this kind of move from anti-austerity into electoral possibility in Syriza, Podemos, England with Corbyn, Sanders in the US, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling that this Laclauian notion of leadership needs to be rethought. Whether we take the insights of Rosichner into this kind of shift to a political Marxism, as I'm suggesting, is something for you to consider. The left turn of left populism in Laclau gave birth even to the sloganeering on the left from Occupy Wall Street's insistence of 1% versus the 99% as the primary slogan of Occupy. This comes from the Laclauian influence. So I think it's important, and I often have this debate in the United States with leftists who insist, especially post-leftists, that theory has no practical effect on leftist organizing, right? I actually strongly disagree. I would argue that Laclau's influence has been paramount. Okay. I'm going to conclude my final section with a consideration and distinction, which I hope will be helpful as we progress in this conference, between capitalist cultural revolution and proletarian cultural revolution. I think a central task for rethinking revolution in our time is to clarify the distinction between cultural and political revolution. This is a debate which animates the two left problem I mentioned before, the 68 left and the 1917 left. You know this thing that Lenin once said when he was asked, should a revolutionary enjoy fine opera if they're engaging in a revolutionary activity? Do you know this story? Yeah? Do you know what he said? He said, Lenin basically said no, which is a kind of forfeit your own enjoyment, forfeit your own pleasure in doing revolutionary activity if you want to kind of elevate to a level of a dignified revolutionary person. This, Frederick Jameson has a wonderful essay called Pleasure, a Political Issue, which centers Lenin's asceticism in this regard. And I think it's a useful heuristic to understand this two left problem, right? Because if there is a kind of 1917 and 68 left that is in a kind of strange rivalrous relation, which I think that there is, and I'd love to actually see if you see that same two left split in different international locations where you all are based. One of the things that would help clarify this split would be on the distinction between cultural and political revolution. Okay, so before we get to that, though, it's important to note that the problem that we have identified in the class transitivity problem has been diagnosed by a range of thinkers, from Jacques Rancière to Robert Kurtz, as a problem revolving around the extent to which proletarian immiseration has a kind of communication, right? So in addition to the two left problem, which is more of an internal rivalrous problem, there's another question of a leadership relationship to working class immiseration, to the subject of the working class, undergoing its own immiseration in capitalism, that I think is very, very significant. And I know that Ray's seminar will be looking at this question, because I don't know how many of you feel about the ultra left tendency, theory communiste, and notes, etc. But as we were talking earlier, this is something that they're actually quite good on. They're quite good on this. Why? Because even though they tend to reject the notion of any mediation, right? So it's not that they're saying the working class revolutionary agent should be abandoned because we don't like the working class. No, they're saying that in a historical juncture, the working class no longer lends itself to the type of mediation that's possible. A. And then B, I think they're making another claim, which is that the history of Leninism in that relationship between socialist intellectuals and working class has been disastrous. I want to say something about that before we get to this cultural revolution piece. Now, the thinker here that I wish to invoke is, of course, Lukács. Can you go to the next slide? Lukács, in his famous work, 1923, History and Class Consciousness, argues, upon reflecting several decades after, that there was one blind spot in his project. Because what was his project in History and Class Consciousness? In essence, what Lukács was trying to put forward is this resolution of the subject-object split. This, in a sense, Lukács had a solution to what I'm calling the class transitivity problem, right? But as you can see in this long quote, which I'll read in a moment, his solution was reliant on what Lenin called imputed consciousness. And this stood out basically as an idealist blind spot for Lukács, imputed consciousness, which I think is interesting for us to reflect on, because it raises both the problem of proletarian, of a kind of gap. In a sense, it raises two things. The question of leadership on the one hand, and the question of proletarian experience on the other. So in 1967, Lukács makes this kind of interesting reflection where he says, I thought that by proclaiming a total break with every institution and mode of life stemming from the bourgeois world, that it would help to foster an undistorted class consciousness in the vanguard, in the communist parties and in the communist youth organizations. Thus, imputed consciousness was tied into the question of knowledge that differs from the spontaneously emerging consciousness of the working class struggle. Lenin said it would be implanted in the workers from outside. In essence, from outside the economic struggle. Of course, there's a very fascinating sub-Nietzschean point there, which is the vanguard themselves, and Lenin submits to this, must themselves be subtracted from wage labor. What I failed to realize, however, was that the overextension of the concept of praxis would lead to its opposite, to a relapse into idealistic contemplation. My intention then was to chart the correct and authentic class consciousness of the proletariat, distinguishing it from public opinion surveys, and to confer upon it an indisputably practical objectivity. I was unable, however, to progress beyond the notion of imputed consciousness. So this I find as a very interesting question for us to reflect back into the question of revolutionary leadership. I was thinking here, again, that Rosicner's model is extremely fecund and extremely worth looking at. I'd like to conclude with four general points. The first is that I think that this wider question I've introduced of the class transitivity problem has led to a kind of collapse in a thinking of the class in itself for itself relation, right? When we abandon a kind of commitment to the centrality of working class, and here I mean like the revolutionary vanguard elements of the working class, and its self-conscious process and its self-conscious activation, in a sense, to me, Marxism becomes nonsensical in some sense. Thus, the Lukácsian notion of the dialectic of the class in itself and for itself has a certain lasting merit of clearly linking proletarian struggle, just as it does for Rosicner, to the creation of a new knowledge, to the creation of a new rationality, to a new ideal. What remains to be made consistent, however, is the problem of how to mediate this with existing bourgeois institutions. A second consequence of this class transitivity problem has been the adoption of the notion that there are multiple proletarian positions that can serve as supplements to the working class, or even in some cases as a replacement of the working class entirely. To face this challenge, it would be necessary to view racialized, gender, feminist, other oppressed subject positions to be absolutely included, and that this inclusion never be seen as a kind of either or binary, and nor that the working class be included as just one more subset. Rather, I would posit that the task would be to continually link the heterogeneity of these subject positions back to the question of labor power and exploitation vis-a-vis the system of production as such. This is a move that Laclau refuses, for example. What that results in is the idea that social demands and political demands of the heterogeneous groups are almost indecipherable or almost of the same quality. I think this is a problem. And then finally, Rosicner helps us with the class transitivity problem, because for the revolutionary group, he demonstrates this quite well. We must remain attentive to the ways that class power also functions within existing bourgeois institutions, for which psychoanalysis uniquely offers insights. A third consequence has been the heightening of the two left melancholia problem. This is a problem that psychoanalysis also, I think, offers great insights and remedies into. I'd argue that revitalizing political Marxism, again, must be willing to center the phenomenon, the experience of labor power, specifically as a means of repoliticizing three areas of social life: democracy and governance, overlapping areas of emancipation, anti-racism, ecological, feminist, anti-fascist, and labor, the sphere of labor as such. Contra Laclau, the demands that would emerge from these sites of struggle must not be approached with a narrowly social framework, but must be seen to be more actively political. Now, fourthly, and in conclusion, the abandonment of class transitivity has led to a fundamental confusion over the meaning of cultural revolution and political revolution. So, can you go to the next slide, please? What is the definition of cultural revolution? It's an interesting question to ask. Cultural revolution Sorry, folks. Are we okay? You good? Right at the Cultural Revolution moment. That makes sense, actually. That kind of stuff happens in cultural revolutions. What is the definition of cultural revolution? It is the revolutionizing of the object of production. I.e., it's the revolution in the thought, the customs, and the emotions in which life interests are expressed. Now, as Marxists, whether we separate out cultural from political revolution, the Trotskyists, for example, do not. They would insist that cultural political revolution always be thought in synthesis or together. The Maoists would not. They would separate them, in my reading. It doesn't exactly matter, because the idea of cultural revolution remains vital for proletarian political organizing. Without cultural revolution, there would be no way, if we have a fidelity to the working class, as the agent of revolution. There would be no way to prepare the working class for such a task of revolution without an imminent cultural revolution. There's one problem, though. And Alexander Kluge and Oscar Necht, in their book Public Sphere and Experience, are brilliant on this. I don't know if you've heard of them, two German thinkers, a bit like Deleuze and Guattari in the early 1970s, wrote on the distinction between proletarian and bourgeois experience. Okay? It's a very, very useful intervention. And they argue that the working class must undergo a metamorphosis through revolution. This is what cultural revolution is. The task is to basically seize a transformation, not merely of material goods, but of human relationships as such. The invention of a new conception of society, the invention of a new public sphere, the development of new habits. However, without a clear distinction between proletarian and bourgeois revolution, capitalism, they define as always undergoing a cultural revolution, which I think is a very, very useful way to understand the lack of specificity that we as Marxists have to the prospect of cultural revolution. If capitalism, they say something very beautiful, which is if capitalism is not put in check by proletarian cultural revolution, that itself will be the breeding grounds of fascist activity. Capitalist cultural revolution will continually eradicate all structures that might enable proletarian experience to crystallize and proletarian history to ultimately simulate itself. For Kluge and Necht, just as for Gramsci, the task of cultural revolution must be set on the invention of new working class cultural institutions and the invention of new proletarian counterpublics, which I love this notion of counterpublic from queer theory. It might even be better in the age of the internet to think not so much public sphere, but counterpublic. So a proletarian counterpublic should not, they claim, denote a specific form of content, but it must apply the Marxist method such that no raw material of social revolution, no concrete interest remain excluded or unresolved, right? So it's a kind of broad tent inclusion that politicizes the demands of the proletariat in such a way that can include ecological anti-racism, anti-fascism, by ensuring that the medium of their resolution and transformation is bound up with the real context of production and what they call the societalization of subjectivity. They write, quote, "The proletarian public sphere is the correct application of the various categories by means of which living interests generalize themselves without destroying as dead interests and norms the whole living substance that they wish to organize. Thus, cultural revolution must be seen as a priority to organize, but yet to do so with a clear conception of the class transitivity problem. Otherwise, the meaning of proletarian cultural revolution will fundamentally unravel. This involves the furthering of proletarian public sphere as a distinct culture organized for the exploited working class, but not necessarily exclusive to them. The proletariat engage in a process of mediation with bourgeois institutions only after establishing its cultural apparatuses as separate. For without this separation, how could a break or rupture with bourgeois institution be given any meaningful relief or cushion in which to gauge the distance or the efficacy of political activity? Without the development of distinct proletarian cultural building processes, institutions, mass parties, socialist groups, cultural groups, capitalist contradictions become undecipherable. So without a codified and organized proletarian public sphere, we lose the capacity to read contradictions of everyday life, which I think is so correct. The downside to which is that it will continue, capitalism will continue to manufacture unripe, irrational conflicts that will never resolve themselves. Thank you very much. Yes. Are we still legit up there?
No, there's a toads.
Turn this screen off, Remy. It's okay.
That seems. Okay. Okay, this is working. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks, Daniel. I'm just going to chair this Q&A, maybe open it up with a couple of comments or kind of questions to you, and then we can have a discussion together. So yeah, thanks a lot for this. And it's very important to kind of begin the discussion as you frame it in terms of being more skeptical about this kind of melancholic position on the left, in the sense of, you know, when you think about melancholia, you always ask the question, for whom is the melancholic position, for whom is melancholia staged? And the question, when we talk about left-wing melancholia, it is always about, you know, the melancholic gets a kick from staging their melancholia, but for another. And it's always the question that strikes is, for whom is it staged? And you propose that this melancholic stance is almost the result of this fissure or this breakdown of the left into these two lefts, or this kind of this problem as you propose it. So I guess the question, I mean, I want to begin with is, I'm still a bit the choice of, and I guess this comes from Nunes. I haven't really spent time with Nunes's work, but the term of transitivity, right, in particular. So you propose it as, so when we think about something being transitive, it's always, the question is about what is it transitive in relation to, and as far as I understood what you were saying, okay, so the question here is, so if is it that class is a category or kind of to be thought about in relationship to these two spheres of the political and the cultural? I mean, is this a way to conceive it, or is it in the sense that, is it that what is common between the political and cultural revolution has to be the problem of insisting on the class, on class, right? I mean, I don't, just as a kind of clarificatory question. And then, because if that would be the case, then it would be the idea that you're proposing is that the revolutionary group would be precisely, and of course, I have a lot of questions about the psychoanalytic approach there, and maybe clarifications as well, but that the revolutionary group would be, in this context, crucial for the formation of the cultural revolution of the proletariat, right? In the sense that, in its coming to its, moving from this kind of a consciousness of, from the in itself to the for itself, right? This idea that within the bourgeois relation, the proletarian position, there's a brokenness between the subject and object. The proletarian is not even there in the sense of the appearance of social relations, right? So the revolutionary group would be the position to kind of reintroduce, or kind of, it would be the revolutionizing of the kind of bourgeois relations by reintroducing what you take from the two figures Kluge and Necht, is it? Yeah. The idea that there's something we can think about that is the proletarian public sphere that does not, in its formation, in its particular group formation, if we take the psychoanalytic Freudo-Marxist account that you use, that does not disavow the problem of authority in the way that it presents itself in bourgeois relations. And when you talk about the kind of the position of the leader and so on. So I mean, I guess this is kind of like just a bit of for helping me to understand synoptically kind of what you were saying, and maybe open up some question. So I have some questions. So first, in the sense of, if you can just say a bit more about the transitivity, in the sense of how does the reintroduction of the problem of class, does it come through the way of culture, from the way of the political? Does it happen at the same time? Where is it? Is this what we think about in terms of the transitivity question, or is it about the proletarian bourgeois, kind of the introduction of that problematique into both the spheres of the cultural and the political? Because that's also a way to think about it. And then I guess the second...
No, you can't do another one after that.
Okay. All right. No, it's a comment.
How can I answer?
No, it's a comment.
Oh,
yeah. No. I mean, and then this would no. I mean, and you can also not answer. These are just kind of my reactions to it. I mean, of course. I'm very sympathetic, and I think the account you give is, and I do think the Freudo-Marxist account that you give is really, how do you say, it has more answers than questions that, let's say, the Lacanian sphere would raise. And I don't want to get into that because I think there's a whole Pandora box of things there. Okay, but the only other comment would be the idea of. So when we think about public sphere in, the Habermasian sense, the bourgeois sense, let's say, I would think Habermas would fall into that kind of account of a public sphere, because there is an idea of intersubjectivity and so on in Habermas. So again, what for you is crucial? What would be the way, or what is it that you take to be, from the arguments they make? What is it about the proletarian public sphere that isn't Habermasian, let's say, or doesn't? How can we think about that, right? I mean, and I think you've already answered these. I mean, I think you already have a formulation, maybe just knee-jerk reaction or forget about it, and people can ask you other questions. Okay. I mean, there's really no...
Wonderful.
Yeah.
No, that's extremely brilliant interventions, Nadia. The class transitivity piece, I think, needs to be broken down in three or four domains. As I tried to intimate, the 1980s, as we were saying at lunch, if we take the example of French Maoism, in their workers' inquiries, developed empirical sort of input from interventions into factories in the age of neoliberal social reforms, the absence of labor unions, the world that we live in, right? Sylvain Lazarus and Alain Badiou, I mean, they were motivated to abandon this kind of working class centered notion of proletariat from these workers' inquiries, right? The same is true of ultra left tendencies. So while my feeling is that the struggles of our present are inviting us to revisit the traditional working class thesis of the center of proletarian struggle, I mean by transitivity not just that. That's just one layer. There's two other layers. The second layer would be this critique I tried to offer of Laclau and Mouffe of not privileging class subject positions in relationship to productive labor and exploitation. That's the problem of class transitivity. So in that sense, you get this kind of unwieldy series of social demands and heterogeneous social blocks coming into coalescence. But because you've abandoned the centrality of linking those subject positions back to the system of production, broadly construed, you basically have a post-revolutionary theory of revolution, which you see in Negri, you see in Laclau, you don't see in Badiou, but you definitely see it in those two. This is the class transitivity problem. I think there's a third class transitivity problem, which is what's our theory for how we relate to bourgeois groups? In what way do they dominate us? In what way are they a problem? And here, Rosichner gives, I think, a very nice argument that they dominate us through calling forth an unconscious dependency relation, right? That kind of unthought social bond based in aggression can be located and transcended. And that is the task of the revolutionary leader. I think the question is, how can the discontent of immiseration that we see on the streets, you see everywhere, we see all the time, be organized and funneled into the institutions of the left in such a way that those subject positions are privileged to an extent, yeah? Privileged is the wrong word, but centered as a means of priority would be one thing that I would be interested in looking at. I think the other piece on the class transitivity is this notion of the sociological understanding of the working class and its changing valences, right? Much to be said about this across international scenarios and situations and so on, but all of which is only sensible if we take the position, say, of Rancière in his studies of 19th century proletariat, where he shows a profound schism, experiential schism, between the intellectuals of the socialist movement and the workers' lives themselves, down even into their aesthetic expressions. How do we take seriously that experiential schism on the left? How are we making room for that experiential schism on the left? Through logics of class, especially, but not only. Which is why I think Isabel Garro is very good to basically say, yes, Laclau, let's open it up. Feminist, anti-racism, anti-fascist, and so on. But we have to have something that commonly unites. And for her, it's the question of labor power, right? It's the question of labor power as this centrifugal, animating, organizing impulse. So there's a lot there, there's a lot there. I think the question of Lukács and imputed consciousness is interesting because in a sense, for Laclau, imputed consciousness is kind of a non-issue because it's not really the function of the intellectual. So with this model, I'm trying to kind of, suggest the perhaps downside would be that imputed consciousness comes back again as a problem. A new ethical question of leadership on the left would come back in as an educative priority for the working class, et cetera, et cetera. So I know, I mean, part of my intention was to kind of bring you remarks to sort of get the gears moving as we begin this conference. I'm speaking at a kind of high level, but I'm very happy that none of you had read Rosichner. Hopefully some of you now will. I don't want to be the only one kind of insisting on this guy's work. Okay, so that's that question. Now,
And then just the point about
the public sphere and Habermas, yeah. Kluge and Knecht are worth looking at. Their text is kind of the anti-Habermas work, if you like. And They have a lot of polemics back and forth with each other. So it's a rich exchange. Frederick Jameson kind of laughs at the notion of a proletarian public sphere, which itself is a testament to how far Marxist thinkers have gone in abandoning the notion of proletariat in some sense. Why does he laugh at that, or why is that silly? It should not be silly, but some people think it is. Why? Well, because there's an argument that commodification has occurred down to the level of the fantasies and the illusions and the possibility of aesthetic myth-making across the proletariat. So the proletariat, therefore, is kind of fully subsumed within capitalist cultural revolution. So in a scenario in which you have full subsumption into the ideological subsumption, they propose a third level of alienation beyond Marxist too, right? Which is this kind of alienation qua consciousness, Kluge and Nektu. So for them, the task is, it's a necessity to invent a proletarian public sphere. Otherwise, you will not stop the aggressive advancement of capitalist cultural revolution, which is constant. Which I think is just a helpful insight into understanding some of the tense dynamics of contemporary bourgeois institutions that we all live with, from cancel culture to you name it. These are a result of the lack of a proletarian presence within either as a counter public or as mass parties, etc. It's only through that institutional development. I think my argument is hinged on that. Without that, I don't really have anything to say. There would be no alternative in some sense. So yeah, I hope that gives a sense. And you're a psychoanalyst, and you know better about this melancholic thing and the kind of big other, and that's a really interesting point. Rosichnera is a lot less maybe convoluted as the Lacanians are when it comes to this question of alterity and otherness and this thing. And he's also much more optimistic, as is Lukács, around being unabashedly for proletarian revolutionary activity to be about the creation of a new ideal, a new rationality, a new common sense. Of course, Gramsci has so much on this notion of proletarian common sense, but proletarian common sense is only afforded by the creation of proletarian institutions. So I was thinking that this subtractive method of Badiou and so on, and my question was sort of, does that allow, or does it even encourage this creation of proletarian counter institutions? And I don't really think that it does. Huh? Or maybe not as forthrightly as it should, as he should. All respect to Badiou. Of course, it feels weird to even critique him, just because I'm a Badiouian OG nerd in some sense. So yes, that would be what, yeah, please.
Yeah, thanks. No, I agree with you about this, the question of that there seems to be in the Freudo-Marxist tradition so many more, how do you say, there's an optimism about the potentials, the way you propose it. But then I would also think about it this way, in the sense that it would be great to kind of try to think about the discourse that would house a group that recognizes or does not disavow its psychological poverty as a group, right? This would be kind of,
this is where the beyond piece would come
yeah, I mean, in the sense that, what Freud's, the ultimate point there is that there's something about group psychology that is just kind of, Freud finds very interesting, but also abhorrent, right? That the group can never, how do you say, escape its own psychological misery.
Sense of persecution.
Yeah, so so this is, it would be interesting to kind of think about that in terms of, let's say, what a Lacanian account of discourse, but we don't have to do this at all here. I think I'd rather open up the discussion to the floor, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions I can already imagine. So shall we take a round of questions? Or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Okay. Oh, yeah. So first of all, thank you for your presentation and your talk. And It was really interesting to the point where I'm impatiently waiting for your paper with the text of your lecture. But also that is because my PhD is precisely on left-wing melancholy, and it stands in contradiction to most of what you've said. So I probably would like to make some more nuanced comments. So first of all, you mentioned at the start of talking about this melancholic issue, two names, so Traverso and Dean. But as you probably know, Traverso is like in complete contradiction to Dean's position. For Traverso, melancholy is actually one of the core principles or like affects or traditions for different strands of the left, and especially for Marxism. And it isn't present just in the 20th century or like a contemporary issue that divides the left. In fact, Traverso's position is that today we lack this melancholic tradition on the left, and that is especially visible once you take into consideration how the left today is trying to be so joyful, optimistic, and positive about many stuff. And in fact, some of the thinkers you've mentioned in like critical comments, so like Lau, Badiou, and Negri, I think all of them are not melancholic. All of them are very optimistic, very joyful, very happy for what may come from different explosions of either capitalism or like social antagonism. And in fact, I think all of it is based from this, I think, misguided interpretation of Foucault's introduction to Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus, where he says that to be revolutionary, you do not have to be sad. And all people after that thought that this is actually the issue. Yeah. So that's one thing. And actually, if you look at, for example, Fischer, in one of the interviews he does that's in K-Punk collection, he openly says that, in fact, we should kind of abandon or change the Freudian model so that we become melancholic. And in this sense, we like have this obstinacy towards, could be said in Knecht's and Kluge's words, towards this proletarian experience and proletarian forms of life that are destroyed by the cultural revolution of capitalism. So that's one thing. And also Frankfurt School, obviously melancholic to the bone. So the second point I have is about revolutionary groups and bourgeois groups. So probably some kind of like cynical or Žižekian comment would be that, isn't it so that today capitalism and new forms of capitalism actually feed off of this revolutionary group energy? Don't corporations want leaders instead of directors and so on? So how would you comment on that? And the third part, I was quite skeptical toward this narrative or story about there being one left, then suddenly being divided by this melancholy or abandoning of the idea of revolution as if there was one idea of revolution. I feel that from the very beginning, the left was a multiplicity of different currents, and this just never stopped. So you see this splitting and this grouping and this multiplicity, I think, quite often. And it is a Leninist story about the left. Then perhaps this is a problem for Leninism, why the splitting today happens and not a unitary one mass party. So that's from me. Thanks.
Okay, great. No, I fully, on the last point, I don't submit that there was one left, which then after 68 was split in two. And I will try to refer to the two left problem as two predominant perspectives, which are kind of perspectives that animate across left tendencies, which are, as perspectives, tendencies which produce a certain rivalry. It's not necessarily the melancholic position which is producing the rivalry alone. It's these lived historical experiences. Some, in a vulgar sense, you could make an argument of a kind of petit bourgeois, cultural new left, like many vulgar leftists would make such an argument. I would not make such an argument myself. I think that in a book that I wrote on the family, I concluded it with an appeal for a synthesis of the two left perspective in some sense. And it is not an unhealthy division, but it is nonetheless, I think, a real one that I have seen empirically firsthand as a certain tendency, which frankly, rarely is even in dialogue with one another, which is a problem as well. And that's actually one task that I set myself in my book on the family. I was very interested in speaking to contemporary family abolitionists, for example, right? For which I do not hold the line that family abolition, even as a slogan or as a demand, is a sensible demand for very specific class reasons around working with the working class today. Such a proposal would actually hit this kind of strange experiential schism as well. That's a different schism. The imputed consciousness leadership question historically also was a question around the experience of the degradation brought on by wage labor and how those subjects relate to leadership within the left. I think the two lefts problem I identified earlier is a slightly different one than that. I think the melancholic one links into the argument that we have, like it or not, lost our way with the idea of revolution. That itself produces a generalized melancholia, purely at that level, which I think is undeniable. I'm not interested in specifying it as an affect with concrete effects. I'm just simply saying that it is real and that both it is a kind of place where theory meets practice. So I think some of the ways you've taken my positions might be maybe stronger than I intended to lay them out. And I'm very excited for you to read the paper, and we can further discuss. And I'm also excited that you read Kluge and Knecht. I think that they're underread and very interesting thinkers. So I hope this answers some of your concerns and questions.
Thank you. I just have maybe a clarification question about what you said about in the part of your talk about psychoanalysis, about the primordial father.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't quite sure that I got that portion of your argument, because it sort of sounded like you were saying that there's some sort of locatability of the primordial father within the social structure, but which is not the way that I would understand Freud, right? The primordial father is what is excluded so that all of the social structure can be constituted as such. So I was wondering, and maybe I just misunderstood, so I was wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit more, and then to maybe open up the Lacanian can of worms. I mean, that also, of course, begs the question about, like, isn't this also a very masculine version of politics? Like, where's the feminine in this specific point that you're making about the political and the relationship between psychoanalysis and the leadership roles and et cetera? Yeah, I'm interested in if this is the masculine side of things. Like, what would the role of the feminine be in this version of politics?
Yeah, I mean, I'm leaning on Rosichner's work, which I think definitely has the imprint of a kind of repressive, patriarchal, state capitalist military regime. So there's something within that is perhaps lacking to the specificities of our present social order, which I'm aware of. I put up the slide on this notion of his notion of the primal father, in part because I was compelled by this idea that he makes, which is that proletarian subjectivity has a kind of different proximity to revealing the monstrosity of the patriarchal father within capitalism. Because if the father's relationship has a kind of shelter from its linkage and dependence on the system of production, he will say that like a working class proletarian subjectivity is more able to unearth and pry open this and reveal this. Now, from that, the question of the feminine distribution of leadership needs to be thought, needs to be worked through, because I don't see it much. You're right. I don't see it much in his work. So I think that that is a kind of a gap, something missing perhaps. But I don't think that it's necessarily something that it can't be done. I think that I would be interested in that. And I would also say Lacanians should definitely read his work, even though it has this mark of almost a kind of, I don't know, an idiosyncratic Freudianism to it. It's very novel. It's very interesting. So I hope that that gives a sense of it. But again, the primordial father is thought as immanent to the system of production, which I found is a very compelling argument. So yes. We have one over here.
Hello, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you something about something you said towards the end around the multiple proletarians, or thinking about social demands of heterogeneous groups, and specifically thinking of like feminist and anti-racist questions as not simply appendages to class, but something that we can connect back to the question of production and exploitation. And I wanted to think of a more practical issue of the question of organization, which you raised at the beginning. And in parallel with that, the idea of thinking of the revolutionary subject as necessarily producing value. And I'm thinking of the debate surrounding some Marxists and the Marxist feminist tradition who spoke about reproductive labor and housework and whether they produce value or not. And I'm thinking of how can we then think about the social demands of heterogeneous groups and connecting it back to the question of production and labor, whilst thinking of reproductive labor, or taking it more seriously, I guess. So I guess I wanted to ask you something about value, revolutionary subjectivity, and thinking about gender in light of your invitation towards the end of your talk.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent point. I was following Isabel Garo's proposal, which is a kind of supplement to Laclau's otherwise very sound discourse theory, ultimately, for how to kind of coordinate and coalesce heterogeneous demands, which also involves with it the question of rivalry across these demands. And I think that the question that I'm convinced by, or the position that I'm convinced by, is that the inadequacy of Laclau, there's a relationship between not choosing something to tether the logic of that coordination and his own abandonment in the idea of revolution. It brings us back to this question of the idea of revolution. And I think this, perhaps I wasn't pronounced enough, but perhaps the class transitivity issue has a strong correlation to fidelity to the idea of revolution. Or perhaps it becomes more of a relativist. We accept it being a relativist one, which I see in Negri and Laclau in a way. So yes, those debates should be welcome as a sort of tethering point back to centering a conception of praxis around labor power. That itself calls for, in Garo's vision, as far as I understand it, a much more politically mediated engagement within a wide panoply of struggles, right? So she's, unlike someone like Badiou, going to be very insistent on experimentations with electoral politics, etc., and even sympathetic to far left assemblies, things of this nature. So I suppose that in my vision, it would be absolutely included, and the question of inclusion would not necessarily have to be perceived as one that would necessarily want to stall us out or result in a quagmire of a debate. I think on this model, it would be very little room for debate on this, about its central role, etc. Do you see, as a counterpoint, do you see something that would result in a kind of stalling out there on that question? Is there more that needs to be lingered with and worked through specifically?
Is this working? Yeah. So I was thinking of, that's why I asked about organization, right? Because what would it mean to think, if we're taking that kind of labor seriously, and to think of it as not simply, oh, let's add gender and race and all these other things, and we're not only interested in class, like.
Sorry, but that's actually the precise thing we were trying to avoid.
Exactly, yeah.
Because the centering of labor power and this kind of tripartite conception of class, I think that a class reductionist view would be insisting on just the kind of sociological inclusion.
Absolutely, yeah.
But that's not the argument.
No, absolutely.
The argument is you see this more kind of expansive notion of
class.
I
got that, yeah.
Even, that's why it's the class transitivity problem. It really has these kind of three nodes in a sense. So just to be clear,
Yeah, I didn't think you said that. I'm thinking of a response to that with you, I guess. Because of partly of frustrations with how unions are functioning now, frustrations with also inability to organize in traditional spaces like, in industrial factories, etc. And also with the changing nature of labor, whereby many people are precarious and floating around between homes and Deliveroo. And so I was trying to think of what would that mean in terms of organization today, to take seriously all these forms of new labor, including also reproductive labor, that quote unquote doesn't produce value according to.
I think it would have to be linked back to the institutional development of a new vision of proletarian institutional organizing. I mean, name how many labor unions today are class struggle unions. I don't even really know if any exist. Right? They used to exist, right? Like the IWW, like they used to have this politicizing function, right? Which could bring subjectivity outside of traditional labor in and included and so on. But see, it's almost as if the task ahead of us requires kind of more primordial class consciousness than we have available with existing institutions, which itself makes the whole conversation almost like a virginal conversation in some sense, if we're serious about this building of working class organization question, I suppose. I hope that helps a little, yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for what you've presented and discussed. It's very close to basically what was just brought up. When you talk about labor power, I've been trying to think about labor power for the last few years, and I don't really understand it as a general concept anymore, in the sense of labor power to what, against whom, in what sphere, etc. Primarily, due to the changing nature of labor now, we are seeing something closer to dissipation, or like a kind of like a gradual transformation of capitalist mode of the capitalist relation of production into one where the worker, the proletariat is kind of formed of half consumers, half workers, providing attention as a main commodity in return for advertising, also providing time in various ways, especially to tech companies. And specifically the nature of employment. Just give you like a very, very quick example of, like, if you're working for a delivery app in Beirut, you're trying to make, for example, $20 a day. okay, you might be able to make them in 8 hours, but you probably have to work 14 and 15 hours in order to make those, right? So you have to wait under bridges until the next order comes because you only get paid by order. So you see, for me, it's not about selling your labor time anymore as much as selling, it is, right? But it's also selling like kind of like a deliverable-based service where there is no real serious employment contract, no real like relationship between employer and employee. The boss is the app, etc. I don't want to be like speaking like I'm the first person to discover the gig economy. I'm just thinking of what labor power is in the sense of understanding. I mean, yeah, I'm also not trying to say that organizing is impossible, but what does it really mean? Where is the workplace or the place where we identify as workers in? Where is it? I don't know. I don't see it anymore. And also just another thing which is related to like the classes of workers across the world, right?
Yeah.
Because was it Negri that anyway? One of the texts was concerned with that, and how do you deal? Actually, maybe Badiou, how do you deal with workers in the first world today who are compared to workers in third world 50 times richer, but are also the part of the proletariat of their own countries? And I think this is just one symptom of how complex it is right now to think of class and labor power.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, to reference Badiou's notion of nomadic proletariat, you know, he'll make the argument kind of building off of some vague notion of a labor aristocracy theory, quite frankly, which in my reading undercuts the working class in the core regions, in the Western regions, as depoliticized. So the task, as I would see it, would be to engage in the politicization of the working class in the core regions with an internationalist focus. I mean, Lazarus and Badiou still say that we should retain the word worker even in these highly liberalized conditions, and I fully agree with them. In some sense, to your point, the concept of worker needs to be expanded. And I also get the feeling from your comments that one of the other dimensions here, which is maybe good that I ended with Kluge and Nekte on the proletarian public consciousness, public sphere building, would be because I feel like maybe this is such a central domain for the left to focus in. Media, education, counter-public, internet, why not? All of that sphere, which more and more I don't see as like some questions that are coming up in this conference are not had in normal university settings, which itself is very telling, I think. So I don't know how to answer the question on the gig economy other than to formulate a conception of labor unions that would be more class struggle based. We're trying in the US, struggling to some extent. The largest socialist organization, the Democratic Socialists of America, has witnessed a growth which is larger than any socialist organization since Eugene Debs in the Second International period, with the rise of Bernie Sanders. But since the Squad became ensconced within the bourgeois Democratic Party and so on, their numbers, their membership has just plummeted, right? Which to me is an indication that, well, of the capture thesis of bourgeois institutions, this dependency piece, which people don't want. Like, the game is up. People know that that's what happens there. It's not a mystery, right? So what is the left doing to provide an alternative to that process? Because the desire is there amongst the masses. So, you know, mass party organizations, I mean, it's pretty simple. In a sense, it's a kind of replay of the Second International without its quasi-racist and class reductionist elements, is what I would call for, if it's possible. You know? And the gig economy piece is a mess in the United States as well, from where I live. you know, I mean, it is at the heart of understanding Trumpism, in my view, at the heart of it, right? This kind of downwardly mobile, former industrial working class faced with these precarious conditions, which is now a question of social death, because the new data about life expectancy of this class of people, precisely because they have no health provisions, is now available. So the way that the proletarianization and the gap of that experience, the fact that we can't even point to that as a class experience, is itself a problem, in my opinion. But how could we, without building these other institutions? Because apparently bourgeois institutions won't allow us to make that observation. They have to be proscribed as XYZ and so on, right? So I mean, it's interesting also to think of the status of the lumpen proletariat as the gig economy as well, which the Black Panther Party, the Maoists, I mean, even going back to Second International, lumpen proletariat has always been central. No longer the peasantry, but now the lumpen, yeah? So what does that mean is another huge question that I would take from your comments. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk, and I kind of wanted to continue with maybe a little bit of pushback from the last two questions, and I'm glad that we brought up the position of the lumpen proletariat and the Black Panthers and before Maoism. And I agree with you that there needs to be, I mean, I want to kind of try to understand how you would maybe how we can describe some of the claims made in the talk, which is that there needs to be, I think, a contra to some contemporary forms of struggle. There needs to be a return to categories of labor power, the working class, and exploitation, of course. And I kind of want to strongly agree with you on the need to understand what are often thought of as particularist struggles, the need to really understand them in relation to the mode of production. And that I really want to agree with you. And I'm glad that the last question brought in the position of the lumpen, because I think the way that we could do that, the way that we could move towards understanding these struggles that are often dismissed as particularist or spontaneous social movements, I mean, I felt like in the talk there was a kind of gesturing towards certain movements such as the Gilets jaunes and the pension reform pushback in France as things that need kind of more staying with and closer examination. But I felt like the quandary that is presented by attempting to understand contemporary forms of struggle in relation to the mode of production, I think that can only come from also other forms of struggle that are, I think, just as materialist, but attempting to understand forms of domination and expropriation that are adjacent to exploitation and adjacent to the site of the labor power, maybe kind of forms of debtors unions, tenants unions, anti-prison organizing, and forms of kind of feminist struggle that think really deeply about reproductive labor. And so I felt like the movements that we were trying to listen to, or and I also hate the term listening to, but the movements that we're trying to really closely examine and extract theory from were not the ones that kind of seemed to be the most generative in that sense. But I'm glad that, that now like this is coming up and that we can perhaps in the coming up.
No, it's really wonderful. I mean, thank you so much. Marx and Engels make actually a distinction after Louis Bonaparte comes to power between what they call the lumpen proletariat of Scaves scoundrels and knaves, and what they call the honest lumpenproletariat. The honest. What is the lumpenproletariat defined by in Marx? It's defined by a non-relation to productive labor. Non-relation, yeah. It's a very interesting moral category. Engels insists on it. Honest lumpen. So they're honest because they have a partial, they are gig. In a sense, they are gig, okay? They have a partial in and partial out of productive labor, not secured. So they're honest for the centrality of proletarian goals. So everything would be funneled back there in a traditional sense. I think for the Panthers, that distinction didn't matter. You see, Clyde Barrow, a great Marxist based in Texas, has a new book on the lumpenproletariat where he shows, relying on Klaus Ophé's work on surplus populations and so on, redefinitions of proletariat, where he shows that lumpenization is so rampant that it is endemic to the working class as such. You can't think the working class without as already lumpenized. And the consequence of that is interesting. The consequence actually is an ideological bent towards libertarianism, which someone like myself and Garro, Isabel Garro, want to avoid, I think, right? So there's this weird, strange coalescence between, say, like ultra-left Tutt-June activity in the demos, where there's a kind of anti-statism mixed even with the lumpen position, which because of their non-relation to productive labor also has an anti-statist position. So that shapes their conception of political demands, which can be antagonistic to proletarian demands. Yeah. So it's that complex status of the lumpen, which is a different status of lumpen than Huey Newton encountered it, right? And even C.L.R. James was writing about the importance of the lumpen in the 1950s. But what has happened to the working class as we know it is that they have become lumpenized, which to me, speaking here firsthand experience, means that there's all of these new impediments to culture building capacities amongst the working class because of rivalries over you get food stamps and welfare, we don't. We work, but you have to get the food stamps. These are real things that divide the working class, right? So the problems are immense. And I think that it does come down, in a sense, to really thinking carefully about class in its full heterogeneity and complexity. That, I think, is a major, major task for us.
Thank you. Thank you for your presence. Right here, sorry.
Hi.
Yeah, so I think I agree on this idea of the proletarian public sphere.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that there's maybe a problem, like, you know, for however one assesses Caliban and the Witch, I think one virtue of it is that it seems to suggest that capitalism was inaugurated always like needing to fragment the working class and to prevent solidarity using like the media, more broadly the superstructure, let's say. And so, you know, it seems to me that it's not just been the new left abandoning the working class, but also like in our country, in the US, the at least 40-year ascendancy of right-wing media, right? Like today we see a fairly consistent tendency of like left-wing YouTubers becoming right-wing YouTubers, for instance, and so on and so forth. So in light of all this, I just wonder, you know, even if we agree that there's an important function by which the proletariat would like, you know, sort of show the like hidden abode or something like this, like how to do that when there's this political economy of media that seems to tilt in a certain direction, like how to deal with that.
I think one thing we have like wind in our sails is the total crisis that bourgeois institutions are undergoing right now, which is, I think, is a crisis of their own intellectual legitimacy. So we can seize on that. It's an opportunity if it's taken up. I think that a new conception of what leftist leadership would look like, to your point about this pessimist Žižekian point that corporations love leaders, not directors. I mean, I think that's a nice point, but at the same time, I think there's also a question of sincerity beneath that distinction between director and leader that can be fleshed out, that could not be co-opted. Like, how do you get out of this post-left American sense that like everything is always already co-opted, and fatalism, political defeatism? You know, I mean, I think that's what, to me, Kluge and Nekta's call for proletarian culture organizing implies, that something could exist beyond the cynicism, that is possible. So there's a certain idealism that would have to be on the table, I feel, and an idealism which would try to meet the already agitated and dissatisfied. I mean, that's Rosa Schneer's thesis of the leader, right? The thesis of the leader is a harnessing of the dissatisfaction at a mass level. Is such a conception of leadership something that we can think about furthering within new institutions, would be the kind of question for me, which again doesn't really strike like the Laclauian left notion of leadership to me. So I think it would come down to that. And frankly, it would come down to having some success at an electoral level that could be then retranslated out to a mass level, and that there be some communicative relation there, right? Which unfortunately the Syriza, Podemos, Corbyn, Sanders moment didn't produce. Things would look differently if we did, but the ferocity in which the left was extinguished in that period, in some cases illegally extinguished, in my opinion, needs to be the source of harnessing something new, if we can muster it. And I too, just in final comment, I'm very concerned about this this weird opportunistic drift in public intellectual spaces, online and elsewhere in the US. I'm very concerned about it.
The building is closing soon, so maybe we can. So I just wanted to maybe, beginning from your own examples of social struggle that we should be paying attention to, that mark the re-entry of the worker into public consciousness in a way that maybe Laclau, Badiou, and Negri, for example, can't really conceive of. You mentioned the uprising against Macron, against the retirement reform, the Gilets jaunes, and public sector union struggles in the United States. And I presume you're talking about, I mean, most prominently the Chicago Teachers Union, LA Teachers Union, and other assorted public sector union struggles. And what
and Starbucks.
And Starbucks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's not public. Yes.
Well, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
So
from that, yeah.
Bracketing Starbucks for a moment, because I think a lot of the Marxist and I think worthwhile Marxist debates about whether or not fast food or chain restaurants qualify as factories or service work. And I think that that's an open debate that should remain open for as long as possible, because I think making those kind of metaphysical distinctions isn't always worth it. But uprising against social reform, Gilets jaunes, public sector union struggles, none of those are actually commodity production. Gilets jaunes is circulation, almost primarily. It's not a unionized struggle necessarily. Its coming into being was contingent upon revolt within the domain of circulation, in many cases by people who, under totally immiserated and not especially powerful conditions, don't actually submit to a boss qua boss. That doesn't mean that they're not proletarians, obviously. In the case of the uprising against Macron, it's actually not taking place at the point of production. It's taking place insofar as these conditions of immiseration are overseen by a capitalist state. And in the case of public sector union struggles, I mean, you could reconceive of commodities to the point where a public education is a commodity, but in many ways, these qualify as commodified reproductive labor.
Yeah.
So what I'm noticing is that all of these worker-led struggles nevertheless are bearing the marks of a transformation that I'm sure we're all familiar with in the structure of capitalism, such that there are workers, but they're not encountering alienation in precisely the same way because they're not producing a commodity. That's maybe hyper-formalist, but I think it's relevant. And it's interesting that these kind of questions about gig labor, about reproductive labor are coming up in the Q&A, because I think that in terms of both the intellectual historical story that you tell and also the specific intervention, I think that at every level, you need to justify the foundations in political economy for the different formations. I don't agree with Laclau either, but the reason that Laclau acquired potency is because there is no alternative was not just an ideology, it was a profoundly potent intervention into the shape of capitalist economies. And part of the reason that people have formed new constituencies and tried to experiment is because it's not just that we have a melancholic relation to a working class that we're, engaged in some sort of psychological shadow play with, but that there are actual forms of struggle that became irrelevant as a result of counter-revolution from above. And I just don't know. It's one thing for us to ask it in the Q&A, but I'm just wondering how you would thread this enormous structural transformation and how capital reproduces itself, and the fact that China and Vietnam are now the workplaces of the world, and those are both technically socialist countries. I'm just wondering how you would account for this melancholia if it actually were to put political economy and not just the reorganization of ideologies, I think, more prominently at the center of it.
Oh, brilliant. No, it's a brilliant intervention. I think part of what I was motivated by was not necessarily a refusal to think this structural transformation, but rather to extract from this structural transformation of capitalism, which we've seen since the 1970s till now, and to abandon, in a certain way, in a way which is more pronounced than what you're suggesting in terms of this. These struggles that you say, each needs and calls for their own inquiries as tethered back to, I definitely agree with that completely. But at the same time, I'm not certain that I agree that that these transformations are necessarily leading us into this kind of place where we can't retether things back to commodity alienation, labor power, and some of these more traditional Marxist categories. That would be an interesting conversation for us to have, because I wouldn't want to get lost. Because I think one thing that you see, for example, in a lot of value form Marxist work, say like Michael Heinrich's work, is a sense of a kind of abandonment of what Heinrich calls worldview Marxism. Like the notion that Marxism should be a comprehensive approach to the building of a cultural worldview amongst the working class, not the working class as a static understanding from the industrial period of capitalism, but the working class as we encounter it in all of its changing valences, which I think is an important caveat, by the way. My fear is that if Marxism abandons that, then we don't really have a leg to fight in a coherent, coordinated way. So I fully agree we need to have a coherent conception of the way that these struggles are uniquely related there. But I'm not sure that it detracts from my main point, that there's something about these three preeminent Marxist thinkers that in a way their theory can't really fully describe this new configuration of revolt that we're dealing with. But I think you've raised excellent point on that. So, but I'd love to chat with you further about that, actually.
I can hold my question if we're out of time. I think it's just a shade of what's been asked.
I don't know, Rami, do we have time?
Okay, I'll try to keep it short. Thanks so much for your talk. Yeah, I'm really drawn to this tethering node of the transitivity problem. Tethering class and all its heterogeneity back to production, the real context of production.
Yeah.
But for me, this really raises a whole other set of questions. Like and I think this is what some of these other questions around gig economy are getting at. And what is production today? You know, in its concreteness.
Right.
Obviously, this is a huge question, but I think this is one way of getting at these the problem of subjectivity. You know, like for whom is production? Is it transparent? And what about the problem of what has been produced, like dead labor,
Right.
as an issue? I think that's really pressing. And I don't know, I found that your distinction between bourgeois and proletarian cultural revolution really helpful with this question. I just want to give a really quick, concrete example. There was a recent strike at the University of California among grad workers. And I think we really had to rethink what production was, not just like in terms of our own labor, but what production meant for the university as a bourgeois institution. Because we quickly found that what we thought labor was for the university was not the case. Like they didn't really care about our teaching.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, this says a lot about the times we're living in. They didn't really care about the quality of what was taught in the classroom.
Right.
They really could care less. What became apparent was that they just cared about grades, you know, the objects of our labor. So withholding grades became a strategy. This is sort of an oversimplification of what happened. But the point is we kind of had to rethink, this is a crude way of saying it, but we had to rethink what our productive power was as teaching assistants or whatever. But we also had to rethink, I think, what production meant in a different sense. And what we found was that thinking of production, not just in the old sense of labor was important, but also the production of living, the conditions of living. So really what brought together this strike was the cost of living in California. So I was struck by the end of your talk when you're talking about everyday life.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we can rethink production in those lines and what that would mean today.
Brilliant, brilliant. You guys are fortunate. You guys have an amazing conference on your hands here based on these questions. This to me, I mean, philosophically, I think brings us back to somebody like Lukács, who insists that the contradictions of bourgeois society need to be assessed from the position of totality. But I think, you know, as we've tried to suggest in this talk or whatever, you know, without the cultural development of institutions that represent the proletariat, the standpoint by which that totality is experienced and so on is going to be lacking. Yeah, I mean, the class consciousness that's coming from United States public service unionization, broadly speaking, is a really interesting one. I mean, to an extent, as to your point, it does defy some traditional Marxist relations of how we define the proletariat. I mean, in a sense, I once made a snarky comment that if you were to take a kind of bourgeoist sociological analysis of these movements, effectively they would be defunct. Why? Well, because they're ignoring the whole gift economy underbelly that supports them in structure, which is this kind of incalculable exchange over prestige, ultimately. Right? You're in an elite institution, you're an adjunct, but you're still receiving remuneration, not to mention the underthought dimension of your own class origins and family and so on and so on. So in that sense, these movements have been instructive for a kind of nascent class consciousness building, which I find really productive and really interesting. Our hope, of course, is that somehow energy be spilled out and spilled over, because we are seeing, even at Amazon, in their unionization efforts, at least in the US, the kind of lack of the same kind of militant desire for this. So there's a certain fight even over the idea at this kind of idealist level, around the kind of the very problematic of Tina itself in all of its, the kind of idea of the system, the idea of transcending our exploitation and so on. And, as I tried to say that, I don't know if you could say that post-Marxism is sort of defined by being okay with being post-revolutionary, but perhaps we're brought back to this problematic in that regard. Is a transcendence from capitalism possible, and so on? That's what your question drew for me. Thank you very much, though.